when I told Nihar what I wanted this day to be, I was like, I want it to be everything I wish I knew when I started working at Domo. And then Nihar and Andy, I want your presentations to be everything I wish I knew 6 months in when I was knee deep in an engagement with a client where we were working with multi-million and for one of them, a couple billion row data sets, and we were trying to optimize the pipeline. What kind of stuff do I need to know? So those are the questions he's going to answer for us. But for now, for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk to you guys about how to structure your data center, which I've also called Domo's identity crisis. I hope Nihar doesn't hate me after this, but here we go. All right. So before I kick off any project, we always ask our customer to do a metric mapping exercise. And from there, I ask for a bus matrix. For those of you who are not familiar with bus matrix architecture or haven't heard of it before, I cannot recommend this strongly enough. Please buy the Data Warehouse Toolkit and read it and understand it, internalize it, and bring that to everything that you do in Domo. Now, Domo is not about building data warehouses necessarily, but a lot of the techniques that we use to build scalable data centers are things that we're going to be learning out of that book. Oh, thanks, Grant. Need to start recording. Okay. Yeah, so please buy the Data Warehouse Toolkit, read that book, internalize all of the things, and then you'll know what a bus matrix is. But from the perspective of metric mapping, what we ask our customers to do is say, where is your data coming from? Who's the data owner? How are these metrics calculated? What filters need to be applied? In going through that process, a lot of times we avoid politics. As a technical developer, I'm very uninterested in the politics of how you define profit margin. I just want you to tell me how to do the math, right? So by asking them to do a metric map, hopefully the BC, the business consultant, and the business can work out that stuff before they come to us. In that Excel spreadsheet that you have a screenshot here of, this is a real customer use case that I did over uniting Salesforce, financial data, project management data, Facebook, and Google Analytics. Very different data sets, but if you talk to a salesperson, like, oh yeah, it's super easy. With a bus matrix, we talk about having conformed columns. I need to have one column that contains dates from all of my different data, whether it's the engagement date, the transaction date, due date, impression date. Dates are easy. But when we were talking about this ability to filter by location or city or country, that's when it became complicated. Because in Salesforce, we were talking about salespeople and their interactions. And interactions were coded to an address. Where did that activity take place? All right, that's kind of easy. In finance, though, financial data, we weren't coding transactions to an address, we were coding them to a cost center. And that cost center might be in a location, but we have to do some sort of a mapping to get there. Similarly, when we were talking about project management, all of the projects were coded to a building where that project, this was a real estate use case. All of the activity was coded to a building where that activity was taking place. So we had an easy mapping there. Google and Facebook, they obviously don't know where you live, but they can use your IP address and do, Google magic to figure out where you're at. My point is I won't start a project unless I have a bus matrix, unless I understand the ETL that's being requested or required of me, and I have this vision of where we're going to go to in the end. All right. So how does that relate to data warehousing? Well, I think many of us are already familiar with that concept of the star schema. We have our fact table, we have our dimension tables. For those of you who are not familiar with this language, again, by the book, but a fact table has the measurement, the quantity sold, the amount of the transaction. The fact table will also have surrogate keys or a way to link to the dimension table of interest. I want to take a second to talk about dates because yesterday Grant Smith spent so much time on building these really complicated beast modes with date dimensions. And I'm sitting there trying not to shake my head because I'm like, Grant, oh, arch rival of mine, you don't do it that way. You build a date dimension. And This is no joke. Literally every customer that I do work with, I end up building a date dimension because I'm not trying to write the same code in 50, 60, 70 different beast modes. I'm not trying to calculate month to date, year to date, or even last week in Analyzer. I try to promote that activity all into a date dimension so it's all in one place. So to build a date dimension, you can go to dojo.domo.com. You should have been domoed if you were registered on Friday. If you weren't, send me an email, we'll get you in. But I have the code here for constructing a date dimension. Basically, we're taking a numbers table and we're using date add to calculate the number of days forward or backward from that point in time. Mr. Morrison points out that Domo also has a dimensions connector that allows you to have a date dimension. And it's good. Thank you, Jamie. It's very good. One of the things that I find right away is that I end up extending the date dimension. So you can definitely use that connector, or if you know that you have some like kind of crazy requirements or bespoke requirements up front, you can also extend it. So yesterday, Grant was talking about how to calculate the number of business days between 2 points in time. How easy would it be if I just had a date dimension that had one row for every day since the dawn of time, and I just have a binary, a 1 or a 0 to represent is it the weekend? Or I guess it would just do a 1 if it was a weekday and a 0 if it was a weekend. Now, here's the thing, guys, and this is why this is so important. I know it feels like a lot of extra effort. But for those of you who've implemented week calculations in cards and Analyzer, are you willing to bet a year's salary that Sunday is day 1 or Monday is day 1 of the week? Are you willing to bet a year's salary that if you were to filter for the year is 2019 and week is 1, are you willing to bet a year's salary that you have a full 7 days in week 1, or do you have a partial week? And are you handling it properly in your cards? If you're not willing to bet a year's salary, to me, that tells me you should build a date dimension. So I'll just slide that across the table. Some other types of dimensions that we see commonly, obviously a customer dimension that has all of the attributes of a customer, or a vendor dimension that will have all of the attributes of a vendor. I should have come up with a friendlier name, write better code. But this is real code that I borrowed from a customer with some hiding of values. So they're building a SQL data flow here, and SQL data flows are fantastic if you know SQL. But one of the things I noticed right away is that they're putting attributes of the customer in the transaction table. And as we talked about, dimension tables are where I have attributes of the dimension, and the fact table should just be where I have the metric. And you're thinking to yourself, Jay, this is an innocent, harmless thing. Why are you making a big deal out of it? Well, this was just one data set that they were dealing with. Ultimately, they were stacking 6 or 7 different transactional, or 6 or 7 different reports that were coming in from different sources. And they were creating the same transformation 7 or 8 times. In code, I have this abbreviation, well, I didn't invent it. There's this abbreviation DRY, keep it dry. Do not repeat yourself. If you find yourself writing the same code, whether it's a date-based beast mode or a transformation like this, if you're writing that 7 or 8 times, it's a good tip that you should investigate splitting your data into a star schema or fact and dimension tables. So what would I have done? What I would have done is take all of the customer attributes and just have them in a table called dim customer so that I can do that transform just one time. I would have upstream, I would have stacked all of the different transactions into one data set first. Okay. Similarly for items, they were doing this interesting thing where based off of the item description, they're creating a unit of measure modifier. So if my item contains box 5 or box 2 or box 4, I want to multiply the quantity by X. And this is a classic example of building dimensional table out of a report that I'm getting from an Excel CSV. And the final result would be, I take my transactions, I join it to my dimension tables just one time, and then I have nice, clean SQL. Actually, dream of dreams, you should use the dataset views beta to handle your joins, because dataset views will join your data faster. But we'll talk about pipeline optimization a little bit later. Okay, so coming back to our I lost it. What are these darn things called? Bus matrix. In ETL, I'm trying to conform columns across multiple different data sets, and I'm trying to split date into a date dimension. I'm trying to split location stuff into a location table. Some other things that you want to think about that Domo doesn't force you to think about, but this causes bad habits, is one, you want to strive for what are called fully additive facts. A fully additive fact is a fact that you can add up across all dimensions. And the one that always gets people is time. If you think about a trial balance, so a data set that has one row per GL account and the balance at the end of the month, or even a bank account, bank statements, I have my balance at the end of each month. It's not fully additive because I cannot take what was my balance today, what was my balance yesterday, and add them together. I would love to, but I can't. Similarly, count distinct, rank, and all of the window functions arguably are generally not fully additive facts. So you want to be careful how you implement in ETL. Because if you create metrics that are not fully additive, you have to either do crazy math to not misstate your data in Analyzer, or you build data sets that have all of these rules and caveats associated with them that make them unusable. Well, harder to use. Okay. So Domo's technically not really supposed to be a data warehouse. Most of us have a data warehouse already. We're not trying to replace that. And although Domo does have data lake-esque qualities, I would argue that Domo is not a data lake, because in my mind, one of the key things that separates a data lake from everything else is this idea of schema on read versus schema on write. Domo forces you to define how the data is structured when you store it. And this is actually one of my challenges with Domo, or one of the bigger challenges with Domo, is I have to think about granularity, or the shape of the data, and how I want to visualize that data later. If we think about the data science project that John Stevens ran us through yesterday, he had a data set of all of the comments that had ever come up in the dojo. And that was cool. One row, the granularity was one row per sentence. Very cool. And then the business requirement was, hey, I want to understand trend. I want to understand trends emerging from this data, and I'll define that trend as one row per word per sentence. And so now my data set, if it has 1,000 sentences and each sentence has 100 words, has just grown 100%. 100 times? I'm bad at math. You get the idea. And so I would argue that that's one of the reasons why Domo doesn't really classify as a data lake, is because I have to structure the data for the visualization requirement. And those of us who are trying to avoid that single use data set model, we're like, okay, Jay, this all sounds terrible, but it's not so bad. When I think about how I organize the data in projects that I deliver for customers, I try to divide my data marked into layers. So I'll have a raw layer, an intermediate layer, and then a customer-facing dash or production layer. I don't call data sets _raw. I don't use that postfix. It's kind of obvious. If the source is Salesforce, it's probably raw data. I don't need that postfix. But what I will include is the topic and the granularity of the data if necessary. So in this example, Salesforce direct connector _account, we're obviously talking about accounts. And similarly, if I'm pulling in data from NetSuite, I might call it GL transactions to indicate that it's a fact table that has GL transactions. Cool. Now, when I go to the intermediate layer is what Ralph Kimball would call a staging database, or the staging layer. It's the minimum amount of ETL necessary to have a usable data set, but generally, I won't show that data to a customer. I won't put that into a card. I might use it for validation, but I won't put it in front of a customer. I also won't join in the fact and dimension tables at this point. I'm still keeping them separate. So here, imagine I'm dealing with a headcount requirement. I want to report how many employees did I have last year or at the end of last year. I might get a data set that has 1 row per employee today. And I'm like, okay, I need to accumulate history. So I build a recursive data flow. Now, all of a sudden, the granularity of my data changes from 1 row per person to 1 row per person by day. And so my point here is, in this data lake-esque environment that we're creating, I might have the same data set at different levels of granularity. One of the things I will try to do is I'm going to try to avoid pre-aggregating my data. I'm going to try to avoid filtering my data in the intermediate stage. Instead, I'll use binary flags like is valid, is invalid, or stuff like that to help me tell data apart. We're going to see an example of that shortly. For fact tables, especially in the intermediate layer, if I'm starting to combine different data sets together, I might have a numbering system so I can keep track of what stage in the pipeline I'm on. So like FN01, FN02. FN01 feeds FN02. That math works out. And so what I'm doing is maybe I have transactions on one side, budget on another, and I'm stacking them or appending them into an intermediate data set. And you might say, Jay, why don't you just do this all in one ETL? Well, my transactional data might be hundreds of millions of rows, whereas my budget data might only be a couple thousand. So there's no need to reprocess this data here. And I might have a completely separate pipeline for the larger fact table. So that's why I like to keep them separate until we get to the production and dashboard layer. So again, and dear customer of mine, if you're on the call, sorry for the surprise, I didn't warn you, but I did redact all this stuff. This is a real data flow that I'm working with a customer right now. And you can see here, I'm taking the intermediate facts and I'm appending them all together. And as the last stage, I'm joining in my dimensional data. And you might say, Jay, why are you doing a join instead of the data set? That's something you just told us. Well, we didn't have access to the beta, so we had to do it in ETL. This bit up here was done, has not been migrated to an upstream data flow, but usually I try to minimize the amount of ETL I'm doing in a production data set. Why? Because theoretically, this data set is being used for one dashboard, but I might have another requirement in 2 weeks to use it in a different dashboard. So by moving all of this ETL into an intermediate layer, I create recyclable code. We saw a really great example of that with this customer where they were like, oh, Jay, I changed the definition for this binary flag. And we were already using it in 2 or 3 different dashboards. By having all of that ETL in one place, the data just changed very quickly and we were able to move on with our lives. The last hard and fast rule here, each dashboard should be fed by one data set. Each dashboard should be fed by one data set. And if you think you need more than one, refer to rule number 1. There are obviously exceptions to every rule, but one of the things I like about this model is that it forces me to conform all of my columns to have the same name, and then I don't worry about that in the end user experience. All right, last-ish slide. We talked about the intermediate data flow being like this staging database, a place where I don't show to my end users. What we ended up doing here is a very simple ETL where we were adding a lot of binary flags, where we were applying business logic. We were saying, for example, if X column is equal to this, then here's this text description that goes with it. Remember that SQL data flow we were looking at earlier, where we were doing that for the customer dimension. Or here, I have this business logic that says, if you're less than 70, there's a binary flag associated with it. One of the things I really like about this approach is if the customer changes their mind and they're like, oh, no, we need to change it to 65. There's one place that I go to make this change, and then all of the dashboards that are using this data set are quickly updated. All right, to wrap it up in a bow, if you find yourself doing ETL multiple times, or if you find yourself defining a beast mode multiple times, move it upstream, move it into ETL if you can. Now, certain beast modes you can't move upstream, like percentages, you can't calculate that in ETL. Ranking functions, you can't calculate that in ETL. Ideally, you're going to do that in Analyzer. So you still need to like watch Grant's content and get comfortable with window functions and Analyzer and all of that stuff. But when possible, for stuff that's never going to change, we move that upstream. And then lastly, we talked about this idea of a bus matrix. Before I kick off a project, I want to know, what are the different data sets that you're asking me to combine? What dimensions are we going to want to be able to filter on? And then in my head, can I construct how that's all going to come together in this nice, beautiful append mode? Okay, I did a lot of talking. I actually flew through that a lot faster than I thought I would, but I'm glad that it went that quickly. Do I have any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns out there before I tackle one last slot? Don't use beast modes as a band-aid for transactions, transformations. Strong agree. Now that said, JJ, when I initially was kicking off this project with the customer, do I still have the slide in here? Hold on, I may have taken it out already. I took it out, sorry. When I was building this, project out with the customer, we brought in the raw data. And we looked at the raw data and we said, you know what, we don't have to transform it. We could build cards against it in Analyzer. And so we were constructing these beast modes with the binary flags and all of that stuff. And what I liked about that approach, and this works really well for greenfield projects, is that I can sit with the customer, I can put their calculation in place, and then I can say, does it pass the sniff test? Does it make sense what we're seeing? And if they say yes, fantastic. Then I can move it upstream into ETL. And as you're thinking about scaling from having a center of excellence to having little data analysts spread across the organizations who are responsible for their own ETL, this is a good model. Because the data analysts, does somebody need to mute themselves? Thanks. Right. If I have a center of excellence, I have a small handful of people who are managing ETL for the entire organization. I want to have people in small pockets in different departments to feel comfortable building beast modes, basic case statements. And once they're happy with those transformations, they can hand it back to me, the BI developer, whatever, and say, hey, Jay, we want you to put this into ETL. Yeah, let's do that. And that's a really nice balance. I think it's all about finding a balance between using tools that allow you to be flexible and tools that allow you to be more governed but a little bit more rigid. I'm being asked, what techniques do I use for building dimensions? Do I use grouping or do I do dedupe on the row key? Yeah, that's a great question. And so this was a little bit of a sloppy example because, oops, sorry, that's not even my dimension table. If I look at my customer dimension here, if I were to select all of my data from all transactions, my customer would be duplicated many times. And so an easy alternative might be to say, all right, I'll do a select distinct and do the thing. Now, I have mixed feelings about select distinct because if I were to have multiple values of the customer ID where, for example, the name changed in January because they got married, then I would end up having 2 rows of the same customer ID with a different name. So I'm not necessarily a huge fan of select distinct. If I were trying to dimensionalize a transactional data set, I would probably use a group by clause. The reason why I would do a group by clause is that when I use that group by clause and I say I want to group by customer ID, now I have to say, all right, it's possible that I could have multiple names. So what do I want to do? Do I keep the max? Do I keep the first? Do I keep the last version of that name? How do I handle cases where there are duplications? Obviously, every story is going to be a little bit different, and it can get more complicated when you start thinking about what are called slowly changing dimensions. The fact that my name has changed over time, is that important to me or not? And sometimes I can just get away with being lazy and just use the Domo, what is it called? Remove duplicates feature. That will just be like, good luck, you have absolutely no idea which version of the road's taken. And sometimes it doesn't matter. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? I love it. Dead silence. Well, I guess on that note, Nihar, I'm going to cut myself early to give you 4 extra minutes. Are you ready?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Oh, there's a whole Q&A box. I'm sorry. I was just looking at chat. Okay. So anonymous attendee is asking, is Kimball methodology really useful with Domo considering that there are no data modeling capabilities? I agree with you. Domo is not a true data warehouse. To an extent, everything that you know about database modeling may or may not be valid. And I think Nihar will have kind of different opinions on this as well. But what I will say is if you've read the book and, for example, you understand the concept of incremental load, if you have that in the back of your head, that changes how you approach really large data sets. If you read and understand what a slowly changing dimension is, if you internalize what it means to have customer names that slowly change over time, maybe it's important, maybe it's not. But because you've read the book, you have this foundation to ask the business, hey, is this important? Is this something that you care about? Or can we just kind of brush it under the table and ignore? If you don't have that, background, you don't have the ability to ask the question because you don't know to ask the question. And that's where we see projects kind of go sideways, where they sometimes they work out well and sometimes they go massively over budget because we didn't plan, because we didn't recognize the gotchas that can come up. So I'm not saying you're going to implement a star schema in Domo. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is you are going to use those techniques to inform the decisions that you make. Here's a really easy example of one. Recursive data flow. Where do I implement a recursive data flow? Do I implement it after I've done all the transformation, or do I do it at the start? Now, in Kimball's book, he may or may not use the language of recursive data flows, but he'll talk about staging databases and how we treat those. So there will be different answers. People have different opinions, but my opinions are formed, shaped, and influenced by what I've read out of these books. All right. Should we do period over period calculations in ETL or handle it in Analyzer itself? Period over period calculations in Domo are terrible. Sorry, Nihar, it's terrible. What you end up doing is you end up building dimensional tables that allow you to create these period over period calculations. And both Ben Shine has talked about it. In my YouTube channel, I have a couple examples of period over period tables that allow you to do these calculations in the data itself. And you use data set views to join them in. So we can do that kind of offline. Will this presentation be available for download? Yes, absolutely. Well, not download, but I will post it on my YouTube channel and we'll make links to it in the Domo Dojo. What's the best way to load data incrementally? Well, we're going to have other people talk about that. So Now it's the top of the hour. Guys, thank you so much for all of your participation and questions. I love them. I want to debate them with you further. Come find me in the dojo. Let's talk some more.